studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we've discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican community and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
and Ryan Buller.
Today we're going to be talking about one of our order's favorite saints, St. Thomas Aquinas.
Was he Dominican?
He was a Dominican.
Okay.
A lot of people ask that, and yes, he was. Ryan, you had some thoughts about some parallels that St. Thomas had with St. Dominic and St. Francis. He also had a friend and companion in the Franciscan Order, St. Bonaventure.
Yes, I was reading a sermon from Pope Benedict XVI earlier, it was on St. Bonaventure, but I thought it was so neat how he sort of paralleled St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure together. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Dominican and the Franciscan orders are sort of like, in a brotherhood. They were started at the same time. They started a whole new era of religious orders, the Dominican orders, in which they weren't just, off sort of cloistered together and living off the land like the monastic orders were, but they were to go out. So the Dominicans were to go out and preach. They were, technically the order of preachers, and the Franciscans were to go out and serve the poor. And they were both basically seen as more urban centered, and they were considered beggars. So it was very radical when St. Thomas Aquinas, a gifted student from a noble family with a high education, chose to join this order of preachers that were very radical and controversial at the time. And seen, in these urban areas going around begging and preaching on the streets often. St. Thomas was very radical, especially early on in his life, and joined the order. And then also he had a specific mission from God, and that was to write down and to, show the world more of God's vision in the order of preachers. So St. Dominic never wrote anything, which we've discussed on the show before, but St. Dominic really embodied Christ in a particular way, and the same thing with St. Francis. He embodied Christ in a particular way. And then so St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas were sort of tasked at the same time. They were only 4 years apart in age. They lived together in Paris for about 6 years, and they were both tasked in getting the word out, the written word, what God was trying to do with these two new orders.
What's interesting, I think, even to this day, that on the feast day of both St. Dominic and St. Francis, a representative from the other order is invited to come in and preach on that feast day. So even to this day, there's very, very strong brotherhood between the Franciscans and the Dominicans.
And Ryan, you were mentioning that the statues in the Vatican of the two are across from each other, right?
Yes, one of God's great quote coincidences.
One of the things I read, little anecdotal story, was that St. Thomas had gone to visit St. Bonaventure, and of course at that time they were just Thomas and Bonaventure, and St. Thomas had traveled a ways to visit him. He walked in with a friend, and they saw that he was writing, and he had been writing about St. Francis. So he stepped out quietly without disturbing him and turned to his companion and said, "Let's just let the saint write about the saint."
They knew.
Saint Thomas, he loved both the truth, and he loved our Lord. But I think where him and Saint Bonaventure differed was that Saint Thomas saw that through truth, we gain through our intellect, we come to know the Lord, and then from there our love grows. He would often say that we can't love what we don't know, and so it's sort of a lead with the intellect and then a following of the will. Whereas Saint Bonaventure in the Franciscan tradition is more of a reverse. The goal for both is union with God, but it's just the means to that union is a little different. They're seen to lead with the will, and then, the intellect is sort of secondary, which is hard for me to even, conceptualize, because I'm, so much, I go closer to the Lord so much in the Dominican fashion.
Well, and for, thinking about St. Thomas, And of course, all the saints at that time, they all had special qualities. But for St. Thomas, he was a philosopher, he was a scientist, he was a mystic, a theologian, spiritual commentator. I mean, and that's one thing that we kind of forget, is that St. Thomas spent several years writing commentaries on Holy Scripture. And sometimes we forget about that because the Summa is just so dominant and so prominent when mentioning St. Thomas. We kind of forget about that. But he was so many things. And, I think people, we were talking earlier, I think people, kind of forget the personal aspect, maybe even the spiritual aspect of St. Thomas. But when he would say Mass, he would weep. And people don't think about that. He had a tremendous spiritual side as a spiritual master to him, and I think that's just sometimes people forget about that because of the Summa and what people really know him more commonly for.
Yeah. So what he was able to do was because of who he was. He was someone seriously just in love with the Lord. He was mystic, and he's referred to as the angelic doctor, which I think is such a fitting title because he's able to see the world kind of as the angels did. He had such a profound gift of purity. He really, his great insight, in my opinion, is that he really saw what we were meant to be, what we were created for before the fall. A lot of us our intellects are clouded because so much of the effects of the fall, and sin has corrupted our souls and our minds. But with Saint Dominic, and there's a great story, of how he was gifted this purity, and there's the confraternity of the angelic warfare, continuing that tradition. But it was because of his extreme gift of purity and his extreme devotion, especially to the Blessed Sacrament, that allowed declarative intellect for him to be able to penetrate into these truths and to proclaim them for us.
And St. Thomas took that extremely seriously. I remember reading about one story where he was composing some sort of document or a text on the Eucharist, and he got real frustrated. He threw the book in front of the Eucharist and in front of the crucifix, and he asked Christ himself to pass judgment on his writings to see if it was worthy or not. And the story goes that there was a voice that came. Many believe it was from Christ, and Christ said that you have done well on the account of what you have written. And the voice said, what is it that you would want from me as a reward? And St. Thomas said, nothing but you. And I think that really is the crux of where his heart was, where his heart and his mind merged into one in the love of the Eucharist and the Church.
You can also see in his music and poetry that he wrote for the Eucharist, the O Salutaris Hostia and Tantum Ergo. So those are two of his phenomenal hymns that, to read those words is so poetic. You need to connect that those songs were written by St. Thomas as well.
Yeah, so the Feast of Corpus Christi, which we all celebrate every year, was most of the prayers and the hymns for that were composed by St. Thomas Aquinas. And he's only written 5 or 6 poems in his entire life, but he's considered a master of poetry because of the great depth and technical skills that these poems consisted of. And so we all get to hear them every year for that Feast of Corpus Christi. And that's so relevant for us today as we're in the midst of a Eucharistic revival in our country. One of the main themes when I was preparing for this show and looking at St. Thomas is how still relevant he is for today. And people often say that about a lot of saints, but there's so much about him, first of all because of his devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and his purity, which in our day of immodesty being so prevalent, that going to him, praying with him, can help us to see the world, to see others, our neighbors, as we're supposed to be. Also in the time where people are doubting the true presence of the Eucharist, reading his writings on the Eucharist. I spent a lot of time in the last few months reflecting on his writings just about the connection between Calvary and the Eucharist, and it was just so beautiful and powerful, and has helped my spiritual life. And then, of course, his academic side is so relevant today because he really championed the integration of faith and reason, and and not just that they're not opposed for each other, but that reason comes from faith. And his academic view is really what a lot of theologians are using today, because it sort of meets people where they're at. We're in this age of cold calculating reason, especially in academia, where St. Thomas's voice can really meet people where they are, and then and reconcile them with the faith.
You're listening to Christ Our King, Catholic radio for Acadiana, 90.5 FM and 99.5 FM and 12:30 AM. We are the Third Order lay Dominicans based here in Lafayette, Louisiana, out of Our Lady of Wisdom Church. And today we are talking about St. Thomas Aquinas and just what he has left, not only the church but the world in terms of his life and his writings. And one thing we don't realize, I think, sometimes is that St. Thomas was very, very radical for his time. Not only joining the Dominican Order, Dominican travelers and beggars, but also he took the writings of Aristotle and looking at the Greek and the pre-Christian philosophers and began to incorporate them into his writings. And a lot of that was done early as an undergraduate in Naples, studying under St. Peter of Ireland. And he actually caused a lot of controversy in the church at the time. And I know y'all have some more to add on that.
Yeah, so I'm not a philosopher. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I've been studying recently because I'm very intrigued by the question of what was the major differences between Aristotle and Plato. So since the time of Augustine, the church up into to the Middle Ages was more familiar with Plato. His writings had been translated into the Latin, and St. Augustine had sort of baptized a lot of his work to reconcile it and to shed light on our Catholic faith. And then St. Thomas saw a greater opportunity, with Aristotle to shed light on more of our faith, using some of the logic of Aristotle. And one thing I came across that I thought was interesting was sort of the integration with the body and the soul was something that St. Thomas was able to articulate better using Aristotle. Because there's always a temptation in the church to sort of say that the soul was good but the body was wicked because God the Father was pure spirit, but of course the incarnation should abolish that, and St. Athanasius did a great job trying to get rid of that. But using Aristotle's logic, from what I understand, St. Thomas was able to better articulate that we can cherish our bodies and our souls. They were both equally created good, and they're both integral to the human person.
Maybe we should also back up just a little bit and talk about, what his life was. I know you mentioned that he was in a very noble family. He came from a noble household. Definitely on both sides of the family, they were related to nobility. And it wasn't easy for him, as you stated, Ryan, to join the order. His family frowned upon that lifestyle. They expected him to be more and have a title which St. Thomas fought all of his life against having a title. He was asked many times to be a bishop, and he begged that the bulls would be rescinded, and they were. He didn't ever take a title like that. But let's go back to when he was younger. And Ryan, I think you were talking about how his family, basically, two of his brothers captured him on the road after he first took the cloak. He first took the
habit.
The habit, thank you. He first took the habit, and then they captured him, put him in one of the, I guess, part of the castle, basically equal to putting him in a dungeon. I don't know. And then and he was there for 18 months.
Yeah, so on the command of his own mother, his brothers kidnapped him, and they tried to rip his Dominican habit from his back, but he clung onto it and resisted it. But they managed to lock him in a family castle, and once he was there, they got a woman, a prostitute, to try to seduce him. And so, that was part of their plan to get him to, relinquish his vows to the Dominican Order. And so he grabbed, many different translations of what he did. But the part that I can relate to, he grabs a fire poker, chases the woman out of his room with the fire poker, and then locks the door, and then carves a cross on the door, goes on his knees, and begs the Lord's help. And in response to this most perfect prayer and action, the Lord sent two angels who girded him with a cord of chastity. And they said, it is said that for the rest of his life, he never endured another temptation against his chastity or his purity. And in memory and in honor of that occasion, the angelic warfare confraternity was started, I believe, in the 16th, 17th century, in which I'm a member of. And as members, we pray to the Blessed Virgin Mary for the grace of chastity and purity by praying 15 Hail Marys, a prayer that St. Thomas was said to have written to our Lord for those graces that he prayed daily.
But you mentioned that back in that time, his family was very engaged in church and in politics. Even when he was 5 years old, his family, sent him to be educated by the Benedictines in Monte Cassino, with the hopes of him eventually becoming the abbot of Monte Cassino. At 9 years old, then he left, and then actually at that age began to study and learn in what level we would know today as like undergraduate studies. So at a very, very young age, he was, highly intelligent, highly motivated, and began studying philosophy at the University of Naples for the next several years. So it's just amazing that, we look at our society today and our educational system, which is, very, very different, because even in Paris, when he was getting his master's in Paris during that time, a lot of the classes and the lectures were done outside in the streets. And we think about that today, it's like, wow, that's just amazing. But you would hear a lot of the bantering back and forth from the lectures and then the students. I mean, it's pretty raucous from what I understand. And it led the groundwork for St. Thomas in his structure of the Summa, because he would state his case, and then of course you would hear people yelling back and forth on the disagreements and the opposite view, and then he would come back and address each and every opposite view. So it's very interesting. Maybe it would be good that if we had those sorts of discussion in our higher institutions of education today, maybe we'd be better off. But that's for another show.
Yeah, so I think it's so cool that, him and, like we mentioned, St. Bonaventure were really there at the birth of the university system, which we have some resemblance of today, but we definitely have the institutional structure. But, they were there at the very beginning of that. They were there when these first, they had a true dialogue, often a lively dialogue, but everyone, understood that there was a certain, a manner of arriving at the truth. And it's what there's sort of a rebirth of a renaissance today of this, classical education model, which they, sort of naturally formed out of this desire to just know the truth. They weren't going to these universities, to get this degree so that they can get a job, so that they can make a bunch of money. That there wasn't this career-focused mind like we have now, like where even our high schools are considered college prep. But they were just wanting to know the truth. They just loved the truth, and they found the best way of obtaining the truth through this model of open-air dialogue with this structure of, having time to listen to the novice, having time to take rebuttals from the crowd, and then having someone who is a spiritual master, equivalent to a master or doctorate degree, make a final ruling at the end, which, like Jeff said, is the structure of the Summa.
I feel like the rewind button today. So I'm going to go back just a little. When St. Thomas first went to the University of Paris, he was renowned for some of his learning, but when he got there, he was very humble, and he didn't want to show his gifts right away. He was then under the instruction of St. Albert the Great, our patron. Yeah. Patron of our little chapter here in Lafayette. As he was being educated under St. Albert, and he had just arrived in Paris, he was very quiet. They actually started giving him the name the Dumb Ox because he was just kind of just there. And he didn't really, say a lot or actually demonstrate a lot of his skills right away. It wasn't until a paper got in the hands of St. Albert the Great,
who was known as the Great in his own lifetime.
Yes. Albertus Magnus, which is what they called him. He saw this paper, thought it was amazing, saw the genius in it, and then called, because it was written by St. Thomas, he called him in and said, I want you to defend this. We're going to be asking some questions, just like Jeff said. They went out. It was his first chance to do this, to defend something. He was very prepared for it. He was eloquent just unbelievable. People could not get over how amazingly he defended everything. He even was questioned by some who said, why, you're just a student learning, what are you doing? He humbly said, I see no other way to defend my position but to do this. And anyway, he made such a impact on St. Albert the Great that St. Albert stood up and said, you call him a dumb ox, but I say everyone in the world will hear him bellow out doctrine and for all time. Mm-hmm. Something along those lines.
Yep. We were looking at St. Thomas, and just to understand what he would, like an average day for him, he would participate in 2 masses every single day. And then what he would do reading and writing, and he would have at least 3 secretaries with him at all times, because he would dictate 3 different documents, or he'd have 3 different thoughts, and so they couldn't keep up with him. So one person couldn't, so he had to have 3 secretaries around. But what I like most about St. Thomas is that he would take a nap every day. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I think maybe all of us might be able to incorporate in our lives. But he did so because he never rested. He would be what we would call a workaholic today, and every living breath that he take, it was at the summit of thought and prayer, and that's why he's one of the greatest saints.
One of the things I can relate to about him is his rigorous routine. He loved his routine. For 25 years he did the same thing, like he said, starting the day with 2 masses, and then very intense academic work in his writing, but all that came to a halt one day. It was on the feast of St. Nicholas, when he had a mystical vision, and he proclaimed famously that after he stopped writing, and people kept asking him, why aren't you writing anymore? Like, you did this every day for 25 years, and now nothing. Like, what's happened? And he said, what God has shown me makes everything that I've written seem as straw. And so that was a message, both to St. Thomas and to the world. As we marvel at his writings, we can, truly say that the eye has not seen, the ear has not heard the glory of what God has in store for us. God was saying, like, look, this is great, and we should love this and praise this, but this is not it. This is just a pale comparison to what the union will be like with me for all eternity.
And when he had that vision on the Feast of St. Nicholas, it was only about 4 months later that he died on March 7th that next year.
Yeah, I think he had a longing to be somewhere else after that encounter, so it's not a coincidence.
Yep.
It's said that Friar Albert of Brescia saw in a vision that St. Augustine of Hippo and St. Thomas, he had this vision right as St. Thomas passed away. What happened is he was said to have quoted St. Augustine, who told him, Thomas is my equal in glory, but surpasses me by the aureola of virginity. And it just goes back to what you were talking about, that the fact that he was so pure and so holy that he was able to think so clearly, and that his intellect was pretty much freed to have the light of Christ, shining brightly.
Yeah, purity is so crucial to our intellect, and then also to how we relate to one another. So I think anytime we encounter a saint or learn about a saint, we should be asking, how does this saint lead us to God? How does this saint help us to love God? Learning about them and their writings. How do they help us to love ourselves? What do they teach us about our human identity? And then how do they help us to love one another? And so purity is key to all three of those, and, of course, how we love the Lord, but also how we relate to one another. St. Thomas wrote so beautifully on friendship. He lived, obviously, the community life in the Dominican Order, one of the four pillars of the order. But there's a lot for us to learn. If St. Thomas's writing seems intimidating to you, like everyone else on the planet, maybe we have to focus in on a couple of areas. I think friendship is a great thing. We can start to look at his writings on friendship, and then also the virtues. Especially the theological virtues teach us how to love God, and then the cardinal virtues teach us how to love each other and our neighbor. And there's a lot of different interpretations of the virtues nowadays, but I always go back to St. Thomas's because he understood it with that clarity of through the grace of his purity. So his articulation of the virtues and how we're meant to interact with each other is so beautiful and so helpful in how we reconnect. When we struggle in our friendships, in our marriages, and our relationships. We don't know what the issue is if we keep having different roadblocks in these relationships. Going back to these virtues, and then we can sort of diagnose ourselves with the grace of God or with a spiritual director. What virtues do I need to work on next? And St. Thomas can help us.
Well, we've just touched on one of our favorite saints of the order, and I know we'll come back to it, especially since our chapter's beginning that task of reading the Summa. As Ryan said, just trying it and reading through it, it's a wonderful way to occupy your heart and your mind with the good, the true, and the beautiful. So we'll see you next week, and God bless.
St. Thomas Aquinas,
pray for us.
Lived through time, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the word. A shotgun blast was the last thing I heard. I rattled in the wind like a window pane. My soul's alright, but my body...